As a prison that houses some of the most famous criminals in the world, when you think of Alcatraz Island, you probably think of Al Capone or George Machine Gun Kelly. But did you know that Alcatraz was also the home of more than 100 children? Hey y'all, I'm Christina and you're listening to History and Hearsay. All right, you guys, I'm going to tell myself here, this is how I typically work. Sometimes I look up and it's been like 4 hours and I haven't moved from this exact position and my neck is screaming at me. So I knew that I needed a change, and that's where today's sponsor, Flexispot, comes in. Thanks to Flexispot, I've transformed my workspace with a height-adjustable standing desk that lets me shift from sitting to standing in seconds. Flexispot desks come in a variety of sizes, colors, and desktop finishes so that you can customize it to your space. I chose the Flexispot E7 Premium with the curved bamboo desktop and white legs, and it was perfect for what I wanted. I have to say, I have truly been impressed with the quality of this desk. It's super sturdy. I got my husband to put it together for me because he puts together all of our furniture, and he commented several times while he was building it on just how sturdy this desk feels. And I'm gonna tell you guys, he's not easily impressed, so that was high praise coming from him. One of my personal favorite features is the quick buttons, which allows you to set your height preferences for both standing and sitting. And I also love how quiet the motor is. If I'm on a call and my back starts to hurt, it's super easy to quickly switch from standing to sitting without having to worry that someone on the other end of the call is going to hear it and be like, what in the world is she doing over there? Plus, with a warranty of up to 15 years, their 30-day risk-free returns, and a weight capacity of up to 355 pounds, you can be sure that the E7 standing desk will stand the test of time while handling all of your gear. Or if you're extremely extra with all of your gear, the E7 Pro can hold up to 440 pounds. So if you're ready to upgrade your space, check Flexispot's website in the link down below. Thank you to my viewer, BDear1, for the story suggestion. I had never heard of this before, and I found it so fascinating, and I think that you guys will too. So, as always, let me know down in the comments below if this story is new to you or if you already knew about it. Just a quick little reminder that I'm not a historian or any type of expert, but as always, my sources are linked down below. Alcatraz is a small island about 22 acres in size that is located in San Francisco Bay, about 2¼ miles offshore from San Francisco, California. This island got its name from Spanish explorer Juan Manuel de Ayala, who was the first documented explorer to sail into what is now known as San Francisco Bay in 1775. His expedition mapped the bay and named one of the 3 islands after the pelicans that he saw there. La Isla de los Alcatraz. Probably butchered that, but translated to English, it means the island of the pelicans. Over time, the name was adapted for English speakers and became known simply as Alcatraz or Alcatraz Island. Fast forward to the 1850s, following the Mexican-American War and the explosion in growth throughout San Francisco, thanks to the gold rush, President Millard Fillmore recognized the island's strategic military value and ordered that Alcatraz Island be set aside as a military reservation to defend the city of San Francisco. In 1853, the United States Army Corps of Engineers began creating defense structures on the island that included a lighthouse, military fortification, and a military prison. The initial version of Alcatraz was finished in 1858, and 200 soldiers were assigned to the island to protect it. By the early 1860s, Fort Alcatraz was housing Confederate prisoners of war as well as private citizens accused of treason or of being Confederate sympathizers after the suspension of habeas corpus. The number of prisoners in Fort Alcatraz climbed steadily through the Civil War, and additional cells were constructed as the island facility transitioned into a long-term military prison in 1868. Alcatraz Island's geographic location in the middle of San Francisco Bay made it uniquely suited to serve as a prison, as the bay's strong sea currents and frigid waters would prove deadly for escapees. At the end of the American Civil War, the prisoner demographics grew to include Native American prisoners from the Indian Wars. Development and construction of the island would continue through the 1880s to accommodate a growing prisoner population that had ballooned to over 450 during the Spanish-American War. However, as the gold rush and wars ended, the need for protection slowly faded, and the island would continue to serve as different kinds of prisons for the next 100 years. And in 1907, Alcatraz became primarily a prison rather than a protective fortress as the Western U.S. military prison took over control of the island. In 1909, construction started on the cell block for which Alcatraz is known today. It was finished in 1912. The prisoners' cells' wooden construction was vulnerable to fires, and after multiple incidences, they were replaced by longer-lasting and less vulnerable concrete structures, a trend which continued through the 1930s. The prison was not seriously impacted by the 1906 earthquake, which ravaged the city, and so Alcatraz temporarily housed prisoners from the city whose quarters were destroyed by that quake. It was also around this time that the island's military defense operations ceased completely and shifted entirely to operational functions as a U.S. military prison. Between 1910 and 1912, the prison was entirely rebuilt in concrete by prisoners at a cost of $250,000. The new prison was renamed as the Pacific Branch U.S. Disciplinary Barracks for the U.S. Army, or more popularly, why can I not say basic words? Or more popularly, it was known as the Rock by those who worked or were incarcerated there. In 1933, the U.S. War Department determined that the Alcatraz military prison was no longer needed for defense purposes and transferred the facilities to the Federal Bureau of Prisons the following year. In August of 1934, the island prison was modernized and fortified to be even more secure and turned into the nation's top maximum security penitentiary. Each prisoner had their own cell, and there was one guard on duty for every 3 prisoners in an attempt to make escape impossible. This led to prison officials declaring that Alcatraz was America's strongest prison and the ideal place to house the nation's most ruthless and notorious criminals. And many feel that the creation of Alcatraz as a maximum security prison came down to one single factor: prohibition. With the outlawing of alcohol in 1920, the United States was experiencing a wave of organized crime. And for the next 29 years, Alcatraz became home to bank robbers, kidnappers, mobsters, and murderers, including many who have been made extremely famous, thanks in a large part to Hollywood. But Alcatraz was not just a high-security prison. It was also home to the families of the prison staff. Many prison employees volunteered to live on the island full-time in exchange for discounted rent. So the time period we're discussing is just after the Great Depression. Even back then, rent in San Francisco was very high. And so the rent that was being offered to these employees was just $18 a month, which even with modern inflation only comes out to about $350 a month for a place with a multi-million-dollar view of the San Francisco Bay. So definitely couldn't beat it. And so this cheap rent allowed these young families to save money for the future rather than using it on rent. It was also a much shorter commute. So of course, for many of these families, the opportunity to live on Alcatraz was a dream come true. The island had 3-story apartment buildings, duplexes, and even private cottages where some of the higher-ranking officials' families live. There were no big lawns or grass on the island, so kids spent most of their time roller skating down the roads that had only the occasional car driving on it. They played baseball, flew kites, and raced bicycles. Some of the kids even raced one another in a soapbox derby, which was said to have been a very serious competition. There were also big game rooms with pool tables and a jukebox where some of the older kids could hang out. Now, there was a strict rule that the kids were not allowed to play with toy guns or play games like cops and robbers or anything like that. But parents managed to sneak them in anyway, and they would play with these items in the privacy of their own homes. As the years went on, some of the officers bought colored TVs, and kids were glued to screens to see their favorite Saturday morning cartoons. 2/3 of the island where the prisoners lived were restricted. Civilians were not allowed to enter those areas. While civilian adults feared going there and mostly kept their distance, the kids saw it as a challenge. They would climb the rocks and try to see if they could sneak a peek inside of the fences. There were guards who could see them, of course, but they simply let it slide as long as the children weren't getting into any actual trouble. One former resident named Bob Orr grew up on the island from 1941 to 1956, and he says that he would encourage his friends to sneak out to camp on the beach. This was strictly against the rules, of course, but the kids managed to do it anyway. To them, he said it was like a summer camp that lasted forever, and they made a huge group of lifelong friends. Alcatraz had as many as 300 convicts living in the prison at any given time, and even though they were not far from these hundreds of convicted felons, the residents still never locked their doors. After all, prison guards and police officers were all over the place, and the bad guys, well, they were behind bars. So for many, it was almost like raising their child on this island was actually safer than the outside world. Convicts that were in prison for nonviolent offenses even did jobs for the families living on the island, like cleaning their linens, their towels and sheets and things like that, picking up the trash, and even doing the landscaping. And every time there was a need of a handyman to do some plumbing or electrical work, the convicts did that too. They even acted as barbers and cut the children's hair. And get this, some of the convicts even babysat for these families. Like, can you even imagine? Everything I read about this made it sound like some amazing utopia, but that one blows my mind. There was even one prisoner named Mason who was known to accompany a 3-year-old little boy, watching him as he explored the island. So not only were the parents of these families getting cheap rent, but they were getting many of their household chores done for free. Kids on the island would see these convicts going around doing their daily duties and wave to them. Every so often, they would even have short conversations while they helped them load garbage in the backs of trucks. The kids who lived there said it was just like seeing the garbage man or milk delivery driver. As far as the kids were concerned, it was totally normal. These men were just doing their jobs, and it didn't cross their mind that there was anything to be afraid of. The warden lived in a large house adjacent to the cell house, and he also used inmates with good conduct records for cleaning and cooking. One boy named Ed Falk recalled that one day when his sister spotted one of the inmates, she called him Popeye because she thought he looked like the cartoon character. He called her Olive Oil and later found a ball to toss to her as a gift. There are other stories from the kids who say that most of the times the prisoners would smile and wave at them, but they weren't really supposed to be speaking to the civilians whenever they saw them. One former resident, Wanda Harrington, talks about how her grandfather was head lighthouse keeper in the 1920s, and from her bedroom in the lighthouse quarters, she could look right into the prisoners' assembly room on the top level of prison. She says that it was there that twice a week the families attended movie screenings right along with the convicts. Wanda recalls how she and a friend sat at the prisoners' feet while the adults sat in wicker chairs along the wall. On her 8th birthday, the men even showered Wanda with gifts. In the 1940s and 50s, there were about 60 families with more than 100 kids living on the island. Many of these kids grew up on the island from the time they were babies, and it was all that they knew. Some babies were even born there, and on their birth certificate, where it says place of birth, it says Alcatraz Island. Being that it was such a small group, they were all very close-knit. There were a lot of social events like Halloween parties and Christmas caroling. Everybody knew everybody, and the kids say that it felt like one big happy family. Each day, all of the children would take a boat from the island to attend school in the city of San Francisco. So the children who went back and forth together said they felt more like cousins or even siblings than neighbors. Many of the mothers became best friends, and they even took turns cooking dinner for one another. Friends would go over to each other's houses nearly every night of the week, which reduced the amount of time that the wives spent cooking. At first, this whole situation sounded a bit shady, but now I'm thinking this was definitely some kind of utopia that most of us would dream about. Joyce Ritz, who grew up on the island, says that one time her shoes were repaired by Al Capone himself, and that he had even signed his name on the bottom of her leather shoe. She wore the shoes to school every day and simply threw them out when they got old. Of course, now that she's an adult, she kicks herself because those shoes would be worth a fortune today. Some of the kids do have mementos from their stay at the island, like watercolor paintings and other artwork that was made by prisoners. Now, I know it's not quite the same thing, but I grew up in Angola. Sorry, I didn't grow up in Angola. I grew up in Louisiana, and we would visit Angola. If you don't know, Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the United States at this time, and it's located in Louisiana. Anyway, so every year they do these rodeos, and the trustees, which are the guys who have good conduct, they've earned special privileges for their good behavior. They're allowed to make things, and then they're able to sell those to the public during these shows, and they get money to put in their commissary so they can buy their snacks or whatever it is that they're trying to buy. And I bought this little leather purse that one of the guys had used his leather burning tools on, and he decorated it in Minnie Mouse. I often wonder what happened to that purse. I need to ask my mom if she still has it. Anyway, this is not about me. While supplies were regularly delivered to the island to help support the lives of the convicts and the employees that lived there with their families, the island was set up as its own little city. At any given time, there were about 300 civilians living on Alcatraz, and the families enjoyed their own bowling alley, a small convenience store, and even a soda fountain shop where the younger island residents could get treats like soda and ice cream. The families did most of their shopping on the mainland since the prison boat made 12 scheduled runs to the pier each day. Families were free to come and go from Alcatraz Island as they pleased, and one of the safety protocols that were put in place was that each and every member of the family had a special dog tag that proved they lived on Alcatraz Island. Now, the thought process behind this is that a police officer might find it hard to believe that women and children really wanted to get on a boat and go to the prison, and so each and every time they left, whether they were the kids going to school or a family that was just visiting the city, all members of the family would wear these dog tags. Now, of course, as I said, the ferry went back and forth to the city every single day, but residents just had to make sure that they were back before the last boat left San Francisco at 11:30 p.m. People were very careful to follow this rule, but there was one story about the teenage daughter of one of the officers who went on a date in the city and missed the last boat. She had nowhere to stay for the night, and she called her father crying. The ferry captain was ordered to turn the boat around and make one last trip to pick up the teenage girl. This was very embarrassing for her family, but served as a cautionary tale for the rest of the kids. While in many ways living on Alcatraz wasn't much different than other small towns across America, there were some pretty strict rules, and some kids complained that they had more rules than the inmates. Though I would personally argue that it's debatable because, as you'll see throughout this video, many of these strict rules didn't seem to really be enforced. While some articles talk about how kids used bananas and sticks in place of toy guns because of the absolutely no toy guns rule. And earlier, I saw some interviews with former residents who distinctly remember their parents breaking that rule. And in these interviews, they even showed photos of themselves playing with these types of toys in their homes on Alcatraz. So while that rule may have been followed in public, it definitely wasn't followed by all of the residents inside their own homes. Any play dates with friends who lived off the rock had to be approved by prison officials. When kids got back on the ferry from school, they had to go through a metal detector to make sure that they weren't sneaking anything onto the island that a prisoner could use as a weapon. And in addition to the dog tags that they wore around their necks, they also had ID cards that they had to show when returning to the island. And then of course you had the rule we mentioned earlier about not talking to prisoners, which there are tons of stories about that rule being broken. In addition to the ones I've already shared, there are stories of kids who traded baseball cards with prisoners. And one of the boys, Ray Chandler, loves to tell a story about how once when he went to the prison's medical clinic to get some medicine, he shook hands with Al Capone. Now there was one more rule that might have been a big one for some people, and that that is that the residents were not allowed to have any pets. Some of the first families to move to Alcatraz in 1934 brought their pet cats with them, which appear to have turned into nuisances pretty quickly. There's a letter from the warden in 1934 complaining about cats running loose on the island and making noise and getting into trash cans. And not long after this letter was sent to residents, families were officially forbidden from having any pets on the island. The American public was fascinated by Alcatraz and loved to read about the prison in newspapers and magazines. Reporters would wait for kids who lived on the island to come off the ferry so they could ask them questions about life on the rock. I saw an interview with one of the former residents who says that at school, all of the kids who lived on Alcatraz Island were kind of like mini celebrities. And the fact that they were allowed to have play dates on the island, which I mentioned earlier, made them even more popular because everyone wanted to be invited for a play date on the island. It was also very popular for teenagers to bring their dates back to the island. In the early years of Alcatraz, inmates had very strict rules and schedules that they had to follow. There were multiple head counts happening all throughout the day. Armed guards kept watch 24/7 from the tall metal towers surrounding the prison, and from there they could see the entire island. Inmates could only listen to pre-approved radio stations, and any communication from the outside world was heavily restricted. Breaking even the smallest rule could lead to harsh punishment, like being locked in a tiny concrete room called the Hole, separated from everyone else. Inmates were not allowed to talk to one another except during meals and recreational periods. Some inmates emptied out the water from their toilets and created a primitive communication system so that they could talk through the sewage piping. This silence rule was considered harsh, and inmates were disciplined for even minor violations of this code. Fortunately for the inmates, the rule of silence was discontinued in the late 1930s, and it kind of seems like most of the extremely strict rules and guidelines were loosened up as the years went along. Honestly, considering that you had to earn your way onto this island, it doesn't sound like these guys' lives were really all that bad, at least not for being in prison. Inmates did say that the island was always cold, and most agree that cells on the higher tiers with window views were more popular since they tended to be warmer than the ground level cells. Willie Radke, who was a cellmate next to Machine Gun Kelly, talked about how having your own cell was a great advantage over other federal prisons because by having your own cell, it reduced the chances of you being attacked or even essayed, and this privacy aspect was also a cherished benefit. He also said that for the majority of the time, the staff treated the inmates respectfully, though they rarely spoke to one another. Also, the food on the island was said to be the best in the entire prison system, and Willie considered his time at Alcatraz to be better than any other penitentiary he had been in. Inmates were granted one visit per month, and each visitation had to be approved directly by the warden. No physical contact was allowed, and rules dictated that inmates were not allowed to discuss current events or any matters concerning prison life. Inmates talked with visitors via an intercom, and a correctional officer monitored the conversations during these visits. One guard spoke about how they didn't always have time to monitor every conversation, but the vast majority were monitored. Any inappropriate conduct during visits would result in a loss of visiting and or other privileges. Now, as I mentioned earlier, as the years went on, it's said that prisoners had a very relaxed atmosphere inside the prison. They had open mic nights where they could play guitar and sing. They had game nights and, of course, the good meals. So, again, not too shabby for being convicts in a maximum security federal prison. Though mental illness and suicide were said to be common on Alcatraz, as prisoners said that being able to see life go on as normal just across the water was torturous. So, still not all sunshine and rainbows because, these guys were being held there against their will. In 1946, convicts got a hold of guns, which was previously said to have been impossible, and there was panic inside the prison. 2 guards were killed, but everything remained calm and safe in the residential areas. It was said that the kids were never in any danger, but the event was enough to suddenly make the reality of living in a prison feel more real. After that year, it said that the kids stayed further away from the prison and did not try to become friends with the convicts anymore. Over the 29 years between 1934 and 1963 that the federal prison operated, 36 men, including 2 who tried to escape twice, were involved in 14 separate escape attempts. Of these, 23 were caught, 6 were shot and killed during their escape, and 2 drowned. 2 of the men who were caught were later executed in the gas chamber at the California State Prison at San Quentin for their role in the death of a correctional officer during the famous Battle of Alcatraz, which is what the escape attempt in May of 1946 ended up being known as. Whether or not anyone succeeded in escaping from Alcatraz depends on your definition of successful escape. Is it getting out of a cell house, reaching the water, making it to land, or would you consider it completely escaping, reaching land, and never getting caught? Now, on the official record, no one has ever successfully succeeded in escaping from Alcatraz, although to this day there are 5 prisoners listed as missing and presumed drowned. Now, one very interesting case that many in the public consider a successful escape from Alcatraz is that of Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin. They were bank robbers who planned a very detailed escape, tunneling out of their cells and using a raft, which they made out of 50 prison raincoats, to flee the island. These guys made paper mache heads and stuffed their blankets looked like they were sleeping and everything. It was a pretty well thought out plan. And while the official position is that they must have drowned, their bodies were never recovered. And many people feel that there is evidence to suggest that these men survived and were just never caught. So that's a super interesting story to look into if you aren't already familiar with it. One of the many myths about Alcatraz is that it's impossible to survive a swim from the island to the mainland because of sharks. In fact, there are no man-eating sharks in San Francisco Bay, only small bottom-feeding sharks. The main obstacles would be the cold temperature of the water, which ranges about 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, the strong currents, and the distance to the shore, which was about 1.25 miles, as I mentioned earlier. Prior to the federal institution opening in 1934, a teenage girl swam to the island to prove it was possible. There was even a fitness guru who once swam to the island pulling a rowboat. And several years ago, there were even 2 10-year-old children who made the swim. So if a person is well trained and conditioned, it is possible to survive the cold. However, it's been mentioned that for the prisoners who had no control over their diet, they had no access to weightlifting or physical training, which the only thing they were really allowed to do was sit-ups and push-ups, and they presumably had no knowledge of high and low tides. The odds of their success were slim. I mean, that's the official story, but now that I know that 2 10-year-olds did it, I'm thinking the chances were much better than we've been made to believe. So I'm wondering if maybe Frank Morris and the boys are out there somewhere. I mean, they'd be like 100, but they may have made it. All joking aside, there has been some really compelling evidence that these 3 truly did successfully escape, including a photo that was taken and sent to their families claiming to be them. And several years back, there was a letter that was written by a man claiming to be one of these 3. He was in his 80s and he wanted medical help. So I will link these articles for you guys if you want to look more into that. I found it so interesting. Back in the 1940s and 50s, the laws around sanitation and littering were nothing like they are today. Sewage and garbage from the island were simply dumped into the San Francisco Bay. It wasn't a huge concern for the people who lived there. Everyone loved fishing on the island and they didn't need a fishing license. And so since there were no restrictions on how many fish they could catch in a single day, men would often bring in enough fish to feed everyone living on the island. Today, none of this would be allowed, and it would cost a fortune to keep up with EPA regulations. By the late 1950s, the high operational and maintenance costs of running the island prison was making the Bureau of Prisons question the long-term viability of Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. A 1959 report stated that Alcatraz cost 3 times as much to operate than a comparable prison. It cost $10 per prisoner per day compared to $3 in other prisons. Additionally, after all of these years of continuous exposure to salt spray, The prison structure was completely deteriorating, and engineers determined it would cost an estimated $5 million to repair the damage. Ultimately, these underlying costs led to the closure of Alcatraz in March of 1963 after 29 years of operation. The prison was simply too expensive to continue operating. Most of the fathers from the Alcatraz civilian families had gotten other jobs off the island years prior to the prison being shut down for good. However, there were some that stayed until the very end, as the families weren't ready for their time at Alcatraz Island to come to an end. After the prison closed, Alcatraz was basically abandoned. Many ideas were proposed for the island, including a monument to the United Nations, a West Coast version of the Statue of Liberty, and a shopping center hotel complex. None of those ideas were ever put in place, and in 1969, the island again made news when a group of Native American Indians claimed Alcatraz as Indian land with the hope of creating a Native American cultural center and education complex on the island. Initially, public support for the Native American cause was strong, with thousands of people from the general public, school children, celebrities, Vietnam War protesters, and even Hell's Angels coming to the island to show their support. And by Christmas of 1969, approximately 200 Native Americans occupied Alcatraz Island. But the small Native American leadership group could not control the situation, and the group suffered numerous mishaps, including the tragic death of the group leader's 13-year-old daughter, vandalism, and a fire that destroyed numerous buildings, including the warden's home, the lightkeeper's house, and the Coast Guard quarters. 19 grueling months of struggles took its toll, and slowly activist occupiers began to desert the island. On June 11, 1971, federal agents landed on Alcatraz Island and removed the last 15 people remaining. In 1972, Congress created the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, and Alcatraz was included as part of the new National Park Service unit. The island opened to the public in the fall of 1973 and has become one of the most popular Park Service sites, with more than 1 million visitors from around the world visiting the island each year. Many of the kids who grew up on Alcatraz look back at their time there with fondness, remembering how much they loved living on the island and how they never wanted to leave. And when the island was open to the public, these children, now adults, returned to work as tour guides. However, many of the residential areas were torn down and many of the houses and apartments no longer existed. But their memories live on, and the children who grew up there say that when they meet someone new, it's easy to make friends because saying, "I lived on Alcatraz," is a real conversation starter. These Alcatraz children and families decided to start holding alumni reunions once a year, which was really more like a big family get-together. But as the population grew older and older and people started moving to various parts of the countries, the number of people attending the reunions went from around 200 all the way down to only 20. And in 2018, they decided it would be their final year to travel to Alcatraz to see one another, and they simply decided to keep in touch and remain friends in San Francisco instead. Many of the former residents still speak about Alcatraz Island as their almost utopian 1950s hometown. And they say that if they ever had the opportunity to move back to Alcatraz, they would. Don't forget, if you want to upgrade your office space, check out Flexispot's website down below. For the next few days, they are having a Prime flash sale where you can save up to 65% off. Plus, you'll get an additional $30 off when you use my code that I will have linked in the description and also in the pinned comment. So go check out the website, get yourself a standing desk of your own, and your neck can thank me later.